Good evening, everyone. It's good to be with you in this strange and yet becoming more familiar way. And the character I want us to look at this evening is Enoch, who is occasionally mentioned in the scriptures, and perhaps some of us have heard of him. But anyway, there it is. Enoch is our character for this evening. Genesis chapter 5 will be our first reading. Genesis chapter 5. And this is what we read in verse 21. Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. The second passage is in Hebrews chapter 11, and we begin the reading in verse 5. By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony that he pleased God. But without faith it is impossible to please him, for he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. By faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world, and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. There'll be one more reading about Enoch later on this evening. Now, Enoch is a minor character in the Bible, and yet he is an important one. He was the first prophet, effectively. Jude 14 tells us that he was the seventh from Adam in the godly line. There is always something special about the number 7 in the Bible, a number associated with perfection. So the fact that Enoch is the seventh from Adam and the first prophet is something that is worth noting. I say he is the first prophet because he speaks of a revelation that God gave him. Now, the interesting thing as well about Enoch is this, that although he was the seventh from Adam, he was a contemporary of Adam. He was alive when Adam was still alive. Adam lived 130 years, we're told, and he begat Seth. When Adam was 235 years old, Seth begat Enos. When Adam was 325 years old, Enos begat Canaan. When Adam was 395 years old, Canaan had a child called Mahalalel. When Adam was 460 years old, Mahalalel begat Jared. When Adam was 622 years old, Jared begat Enoch. And when Adam was 687 years old, Enoch had a child called Methuselah. When Adam was 874 years old, Methuselah had a child called Lamech. And when Lamech was 56 years old, Adam died. So Adam knew Enoch, and Enoch knew Adam. I wonder how often Enoch, who has a reputation for being a very godly man, visited Adam and spoke to him about what the Garden of Eden had been like in the beginning and how he had walked with God in that garden. And I wonder how often he asked him, what went wrong? Why did sin come into this world? Why did Eve do what she did in disobeying God? So Enoch was taken up to heaven in the year 987. Interesting. Seth was still alive when Enoch was taken up to heaven. Seth, of course, was one of Adam's children. Seth was 857 years old when Enoch was taken up to heaven. This means that everyone from Seth to Lamech was around when Enoch was taken up to heaven. Only Adam had died when Enoch was taken back into heaven, and that meant that everyone saw only one death until Enoch disappeared. What an encouragement. Adam had to leave Eden, but just 57 years after he died, someone in the 7th generation from him made it back to heaven. And that's a message of hope to us all. So much then for the characters around. Adam would have known Enoch. Adam was the only one who had died by the time Enoch was taken up into heaven. And Enoch was a very, very young man compared to the others when God took him. Excuse me. Now, my first heading for Enoch is this. Enoch walked with God. We know that Adam walked with God. We've mentioned that already because he walked with God in the Garden of Eden, literally speaking. But Enoch walked with God spiritually speaking. In other words, he communicated with him, he talked with him, he spent time with him, and we have this lovely expression, to walk with God. Let's think of a few things necessary with walking with God. First of all, Hebrews chapter 11 would tell us in verse 6 that in order to walk with God, you have to believe in the existence of God. It says this about Enoch, as we read together in chapter 11. Enoch was taken up to heaven that he should not see death, and he was not found because God took him to heaven. For before his translation into heaven, he had this testimony that he pleased God, but without faith it is impossible to please him. Now this is the point. He that cometh to God must believe that he is. So very evidently Enoch believed in the existence of the invisible God. Without faith, it's impossible to please God, for he that comes to him must believe that he is. That's step number one. Step number two, he didn't just believe in the existence of God, he hungered after God. He longed for the presence of God. That is also said in Hebrews 11, verse 6, where it says, we must believe that God is, and that he is the rewarder of those that diligently seek him. So Enoch believed in the existence of God, and he hungered after the presence of God. He diligently sought him. He went out of his way to spend time with him. And the third point is this, that he lived in the light of God. He pleased God. 11 verse 5 of chapter of Hebrews, he had this testimony that he pleased God. And then again, walking with God meant that he listened to the word of God. And we know that because of the name he gave to his son. But I'll come to that in a moment, the name Methuselah. So in order to walk with God, Enoch believed in the existence of God, hungered after the presence of God, lived in the light of the presence of God, and listened to the word of God. And you and I must do the same if we wish to walk with God from day to day. We need to believe in his existence, hunger for his presence, live in the light of his fellowship, and listen to his word. Not only did Enoch walk with God, but he stood for the cause of God. Now here we have to go to the little letter of Jude to read about this. He stood for the cause of God. And whilst you are looking for the little letter of Jude, and we're going to look at verse 14, let's remind ourselves that the reward that Enoch had for walking with God is that one day he went out of his house and he walked over the hills in communication with his God, and he walked straight into heaven, and he was never seen again. What a wonderful way to go. But there it is. That was walking with God. He stood for the cause of God. Verse 14 of Jude. Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these wicked people, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints, to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds which they have ungodly committed, and of all their hard speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. These are murmurers, complainers, walking after their own lusts, and their mouth speaking great swelling words, having men's persons in admiration because of advantage. Interesting. Enoch stood for the cause of God. Now, this is where I say he was the first prophet. He named his son Methuselah. When he is dead, it shall be sent, or at least that's the way I was brought up to believe it was translated. Some people say it means man of the sword, but then if you mean man of the sword as the time of God's judgment, you can imagine that it would mean the same thing. He prophesied, the first prophet. He had seen a vision, or perhaps God had told him of a time to come when God would come with 10,000 of his saints. And he spoke of the coming judgment, and he was so convinced of it that he named his son Methuselah. When he is dead, it shall be sent, or man of the sword, the judgment of God. And interestingly enough, Methuselah lived the longest of all mankind, 969 years, and he died not only the year that the flood was sent, but 1 week before the flood was sent. And the prophecy was, when he is dead, it shall be sent, and 7 days later, the flood came. I wonder whether that is one reason why Hebrews chapter 11 tells us that after Enoch's death, by faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark, because he had heard that when Enoch's son Methuselah died, it would come, and he was warned. Notice that God was prepared to let Methuselah live the longest of them all, perhaps showing some measure of reluctance in judging sin until it was fully ripe and he had had enough of it, but there it is. So what was it then that Enoch saw? Well, Jude 14 tells us he saw the coming of the Lord. He saw him coming in judgment with 10,000s of his saints, a mixture, I suppose, of angels and believers coming, according to perhaps Revelation 19 and verse 11, that final Armageddon judgment when he comes to this earth and he judges all and convicts all that are ungodly. And Enoch saw it. Not only did he see the coming of the Lord, he saw the company of the Lord, angels and saints coming together as an army to judge this world. When the Lord comes for his people, it will be an invisible coming. Only we will see him when we are changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. But when he comes in judgment, every eye shall see him. And he will come, as it is, riding on a war horse, figuratively speaking, ready to judge the world. Enoch saw the coming of the Lord, he saw the company of the Lord, and he saw the cause of the Lord to execute judgment and to convict men of sin. And notice the frequent use of the word ungodly. The Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment upon all, to convince all that are ungodly of their ungodly deeds which they have ungodly committed, and all of their hard speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. If the heart of God was grieved to see the extent of sin in the world, I think we see something of the grief that Enoch experienced as he saw all the ungodly men round about him and their ungodly deeds which they ungodly committed, and so on. He stood for the cause of God in his generation. When it comes to Noah, of course, there was hardly anybody of the godly line left. All of them had died. All that was left basically were the ungodly line of Cain. But Noah and his sons and his daughters-in-law and his wife, 8 of them were preserved. Apart from that, there was no one left. And God finally had had enough and judged the world with a flood. Quite a character then, this Enoch, who walked with God and stood for the cause of God. And finally, my third point is that he escaped into the presence of God. He was not found, for God took him. Remember again this image that we have in our minds of him walking across the hills, communing with his God, and suddenly walking from this world into the next, walking from earth into heaven, and forever in the presence of God. Enoch is still alive and has never died. And I wonder what search parties were sent out for him to find his body until it was realized that he was not, for God took him. And what a testimony he must have been to the people round about him, that God had loved him so much that he took him straight into his presence to commune with him forever. And then he is a picture of the church, the believers, the saints, who will one day be taken into the presence of God before judgment falls upon this earth in that tribulation period. And we, like Enoch, will be taken into heaven before it comes. So there's an example for us. If we wish to walk with God today, we must believe in the existence of God, hunger after the presence of God, live in the light of the glory of God and fellowship of God, and listen to his word. When we do that, we should stand for the cause of God. We should grieve over what grieves him. We should be pleased with what pleases him. We should be those who are willing to stand for God's cause in an ungodly generation and perhaps in our lifetime. Like Enoch, one day we will just disappear from this earth, and they will send out search parties all over the place to try to find where all these millions of Christians have gone, and they will not find us, for God will take us. A minor character, a major example. May God help us all to be little Enochs today, to walk with God, to stand for God, and then to be taken into his presence forever. God bless you all, and God bless his word to us this evening.